Professor Musa is professor of Islamic Studies at Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and the History Department. His interests span both classical and modern Islamic thought, and he is helping lead our new Keough School of Global Affairs initiative in global religion and human development. Professor Musa.
Thank you very much, Chris. Welcome and thank you. The Center for Civil and Human Rights in the Keough School of Global Affairs and the Center for Social Concern take pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Reverend Joseph Tobin, Archbishop of Indianapolis and Cardinal-elect today to Notre Dame. I want to thank Jennifer McCord, Kevin Fye, and Christine Chevenak of the Center for Civil Rights and Civil and Human Rights, and Father Coleman of the Center for Social Concerns for making it possible for our guests to be here today. And I must also thank my very able assistant, Nicholas Roberts, in helping me prepare for this event and other issues. Archbishop Tobin was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1952, and he's the eldest of 13 children. He was raised in the congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer, and in 1975, he earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the Holy Redeemer College in Waterford, Wisconsin. In 1979, he earned a master's in religious education and a master's of divinity from Mount St. Alphonsus Seminary in Esopus, New York. And he was ordained a priest on June 1, 1978. He's got a very long bio, and will take up us another 15 minutes, but I'm just going to highlight that on 3rd of December 2012, he was installed as the 6th Archbishop of Indianapolis and at SS Peter and Paul Cathedral. And this past week, in October 2016, Pope Francis announced 17 new cardinals, including Archbishop Joseph Tobin. He will now be one of the people who will decide who in future will be the Pope of the Catholic Church. It demonstrates the direction of the new Catholic Church as we understand it. I want to say a few things about Archbishop Tobin, but I cannot go in great detail. But two of his statements stand out in particular with regard to refugees. He said that we are an immigrant church, a pilgrim people on a journey of faith. We are fellow travelers on the way to our heavenly home. As members of Christ's body, we are a diverse group of people called to unity in Christ. Every person, regardless of his or her place of origin, ethnic or cultural heritage, economic or social position, and legal status, should be welcomed as Christ and should be encouraged to feel a genuine sense of membership and belonging in our country and our church. And this is not a political statement, the next one I'm going to read. He defied Governor Mike Pence by resettling a Syrian family in 2015. And he said, for 40 years, the Archdiocese Refugee and Immigrant Service has welcomed people fleeing violence in various regions of the world. This is an essential part of our identity as Catholic Christians, and we will continue this life-saving tradition. As many of you know, that the issue of refugees has been highly politicized in Europe and in the US during this political season. Today, Archbishop Tobin will share with us his views based on the moral teachings of the Roman Catholic Church, why it is imperative to assist refugees. This issue is, of course, very sensitive, since it emanates out of a political cauldron in the Middle East, in which we, the US, played a big role in 2003. Since then, Christians and other religious minorities, but including a great deal of Muslims, have been seriously impacted by the civil wars in various countries, especially in Iraq and in Syria. The majority of refugees are Muslim. Archbishop Tobin will discuss the fear that has been generated around the question of refugees and how the Catholic community may address that anxiety. He will describe the circumstances surrounding a public controversy in December 2015 with the governor of Indiana regarding the resettlement of Syrian refugees by the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please help me to warmly welcome Archbishop Tobin to Notre Dame and to address us.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that gracious introduction, and thank you. I always think the people who applaud before they hear a speaker have great faith or tolerance. I'm delighted to be here. In the years that I lived in Rome, I shared a community with a French priest, a very lovely fellow from Lyon. And he would see the T-shirts that I would often wear, and one day he pulled me aside and said, "Why are you so interested in the cathedral in Paris?" I said, "It's a much holier place than that." I'd like to begin this modest contribution with some contemporary quotes that I think can frame the argument. Last Sunday, many of you tuned into the debate, and you heard the Republican candidate for the presidency of the United States call for a policy of extreme vetting of refugees coming from Syria. Now, he justified his position because, and I quote, "They're coming in by tens of thousands into our country, like we have no idea who they are, where they come from, what their feelings about our country are." The candidate termed the present efforts by the federal government to resettle refugees as, quote, "the great Trojan horse of all time." 3 days later, last Wednesday, October 12th, the Bishop of Rome issued a clear call for the community of nations to intensify efforts to receive and resettle refugees from around the world, but particularly from the martyred country of Syria, his words. Emphasizing the intense efforts to receive and resettle refugees and immigrants, Pope Francis appealed to everyone, but especially everyone that is states, institutions, and religious communities, to work for the protection, especially of child immigrants. He also emphasized the pressing need for a long-term solution that tackled the root causes of this phenomenon. Now, I think, friends, that the positions of Mr. Trump and Pope Francis regarding the resettlement of refugees, particularly those who are fleeing the carnage in Syria, are well known and diametrically opposed. Policy regarding refugees figures prominently in the rhetoric of this election cycle. Late last year, the state of Indiana provided a stage for this debate, when policies of the governor were contested by different faith-based organizations, including the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Indianapolis. I'm grateful to the university for this opportunity to discuss with you the events of last November and December against the backdrop of the enormous humanitarian tragedy, as well as the ethical claims that tragedy have upon us, the citizens of this country and people of goodwill. What I hope to do is trace the history of refugee resettlement in the United States, and I apologize if this is old hat for some of you, before I describe my decision to continue to welcome Syrian refugees, a decision that put me at odds with Governor Mike Pence. Then I'll invite you to look with me at what I think is the source of the difference, a fear that blinds not only politicians but fellow citizens to the human tragedy of those fleeing violence before considering the question of an ethical response. I'm delighted that my modest contribution will be followed by an opportunity for discussion with Professor, with Ibrahim, and with all of you. And please do not hesitate to ask for clarifications or corrections. Now, I begin with just a brief summary of the history of the organized resettlement of refugees in the United States of America. And I hope to demonstrate the important role that faith-based organizations have played in that process. You know that since its foundation, the United States has offered freedom and opportunity to refugees fleeing the world's most dangerous and desperate situations. The United States Refugee Program reflects the core values of the United States and our strong tradition of providing a safe haven for the oppressed. Refugees have been coming to this country since the 17th century, when pilgrims fleeing religious persecution in England arrived. However, the U.S. Congress enacted the first refugee legislation only in 1948, following the admission of more than 250,000 displaced Europeans in the wake of World War II. This legislation provided for the admission of an additional 400,000 displaced Europeans in the coming years. Later laws provided for the admission of persons fleeing communism, largely from China, Hungary, Korea, Poland, and Yugoslavia. And then in the 1960s, those who were fleeing the regime in Cuba. Many of these refugees were assisted by American ethnic and religious-based non-profit organizations, which form the base for today's vibrant public and private partnership in U.S. refugee resettlement efforts. With the fall of Saigon in April of 1975, the United States faced the challenge of resettling hundreds of thousands of refugees from Indochina, principally from Vietnam. As a result, the Congress passed the Refugee Act of 1980, which standardized federally supported resettlement services for all refugees admitted to the United States. This act incorporates the definition of refugee that's used in the United Nations Refugee Convention and provides for regular and emergency admission of refugees of all nationalities. And you can see the definition of a refugee taken from the UN Convention: someone who, owing to the well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fear, unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. The Refugee Act provided for the legal basis for the establishment of the Office of Refugee Resettlement as part of the Department of Health and Human Services. Since 1975, the United States has resettled more than 3 million refugees. Most have come from Vietnam or the former Soviet Union, although more than 70 nationalities are represented within those 3 million people. Since the enactment of the Refugee Act of 1980, annual admission figures have ranged from a high of 207,116 in 1980 to a low of 27,100 the year following September 11th, 2001. 70,000 refugees were admitted in both 2013 and 2014. This fiscal year, the U.S. plans to accept 85,000, including 10,000 from the country of Syria. Now, that's a fraction of the more than 4 million Syrians displaced by the war since 2011. You can contrast that figure of 10,000 being received by the United States to the 1.5 million that have been received in Lebanon, a country of only 4 million people. Refugees, having suffered great losses, including the loss of their homes, livelihoods, possessions, and oftentimes families, need assistance starting over in a new country. Their initial needs are many, and you can imagine them: food, clothing, shelter, employment. In this country, English as a second language, orientation to a new community and culture. Across the United States, Catholic Charities have been providing services to refugees and immigrants for more than 100 years, an ongoing demonstration of a strong commitment to serve the most vulnerable in our society. In partnership with other affiliates, and you can see some of them there that are active in the United States in resettling, working with the federal government and resettling agencies. The Catholic Refugee Resettlement Network includes over 100 diocesan offices across the United States, as well as Guam and Puerto Rico. Last year, the Catholic charity agencies settled a third of the approximately 70,000 that were welcomed into the United States. The Migration and Refugee Services Office of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops searches for innovative and cost-effective approaches to help refugees rebuild their lives. Over the years, Archdiocesan Catholic Charities have found the best approach to resettlement is one that emphasizes employment for refugees as a means to self-sufficiency while addressing their transitional needs. The courage and the resiliency of refugees are shown in the high rate of employment found among refugees at just 6 months after their arrival in the United States. Certainly another incredibly encouraging sign is how quickly their children adopt to schooling in this country. One of the Syrian families tells me that their children wake them up on Sundays because they're afraid they're going to miss school. Resettling refugees provides an extraordinary opportunity for countless Americans to take an active part in offering a caring and supportive environment for refugees as they begin their new lives. In the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, and I dare say in those other 100 agencies across the United States, without volunteers and resources from the community and parishes, the USCCB and its Migrant and Refugee Services, as well as the diocesan resettlement offices, would be unable to accomplish the tremendous task of giving refugees new hope and the opportunity to begin life again. Now, I hope you can see that throughout the history of the United States, but especially in the organized resettlement of refugees, faith-based communities, not-for-profits, NGOs have played an important role. Now, this proud and welcoming tradition of our country, as well as the fruitful cooperation between the state of Indiana and the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Indianapolis, foundered in the last quarter of 2015. You may recall that in the wake of the terrorist attacks in Paris, a number of states announced that they would no longer welcome refugees from Syria. On November 16th, citing concerns about safety and security, Governor Mike Pence blocked Syrian refugees from resettling in Indiana. In a statement, Pence said that he would bar Syrian refugees from resettling in Indiana until the federal government could make sure that, quote, proper security measures are in place, unquote. In a letter dated 11/17/2015, the director of the Indiana Family and Social Service Administration informed the refugee resettlement program of our archdiocese, and I'll read you the pertinent paragraph. We would ask that you notify your national resettlement agency that the scheduled placement for the Syrian family scheduled to arrive Thursday, December 10th, and all subsequent Syrian arrivals be suspended or redirected to another state that is willing to accept Syrian placements until assurances that proper security measures are in place provided by the federal government. Let me tell you just briefly about the family. It was four Syrians, mom, dad, and 2 little kids. I won't tell you their names because one of my goals has been to keep them from being exploited, not that you would do that, but just to be consistent with past refusals. They had fled their homeland in 2012, and for 3 years were housed in a refugee camp in Jordan. For more than 2 of those 3 years, they had undergone the stringent vetting process that is overseen by the Department of Homeland Security and executed by a number of other agencies of the federal government, including the National Counterterrorism Center and other intelligence communities the FBI, and the State Department. Following receipt of that letter by our Department of Refugee Resettlement, I requested a meeting with Governor Pence. On the afternoon of Wednesday, December 2nd, 2015, a small delegation arrived at the State House. I was accompanied by the Director of Catholic Charities for the Archdiocese, a wonderful woman who oversees our refugee resettlement programs, the Director of the Indiana Catholic Conference, our liaison with the state legislature, and Ali, an Iraqi refugee who was resettled by our program nearly a decade before and who had recently become an American citizen. I invited Ali to join our little group because I wanted to put a face on statistics. I wanted the governor to understand that when we talk about refugees, this is what we're talking about. Ali is a very ebullient fellow. He studied English literature at the University of Baghdad. He could quote Shakespeare. He was quite proud of that. He was working as the captain of coffee service at a large Indianapolis hotel. And he told the governor about his dream that one day his family could join him in the United States of America. During the course of the meeting, the governor spoke of his desire to protect the citizens of the state from terrorism. And he justified his decision with two facts, as he would put it. He pointed to a discovery of a purported Syrian passport in the vicinity of a body of one of the dead attackers in Paris that carried out the attacks of the previous September. He also cited the present director of the FBI as being unable to guarantee that Syrians entering this country were not, in fact, threats to its citizens. He was confident that legislation then pending in Congress, the so-called SAVE Act, would close any loopholes in the vetting process. Probably would have closed a lot of doors as well. He asked me not to permit the resettlement of the family who was scheduled to arrive the following week. He advised me to pray and seek God's guidance before deciding. I was happy to follow that counsel. And after a day or two of that sort of stuff, I was convinced that the decision to bar the family was immoral, capricious, and probably illegal. So the following Saturday, December 5th, 2015, I telephoned Governor Pence and respectfully informed him that the Archdiocese would welcome the family as planned. We were prepared to support the family if the state, as it had threatened, denied the federal monies that were owed to them. In a press release that Professor quoted, I reiterated the reasons behind my decision. And if you don't mind, I'll just say them again. 3 years ago, this family fled the violence of terrorists in their homeland of Syria. After 2 years of extensive security checks and personal interviews, the United States government asked the Archdiocese of Indianapolis to help resettle this family. For 40 years, the Archdiocese's Refugee and Immigrant Services has welcomed people fleeing violence in various regions of the world. This is an essential part of our identity as Catholic Christians, and we will continue this life-saving tradition. Following the decision to settle refugees and actually following their arrival, it pays to have a priest who works at the airport. Governor Mike Pence's spokesman, Matt Lloyd, issued this statement on December 8th of last year. The governor holds Catholic Charities in the highest regard, but respectfully disagrees with their decision to place a Syrian refugee family in Indiana at this time. Now, what's happened in the nearly 12 months since that confrontation? Well, first, Congress did not enact more stringent legislation, as the governor had hoped. You might recall that that act passed in the House but was blocked in the Senate. The carnage in Syria has continued unabated. More than 3,500 people have drowned in the Mediterranean in those 12 months. Nearly 600 more people compared to the same period of the previous year. According to a press release earlier this month by Save the Children, among the dead are at least 600 children. Exodus Refugee Immigration, a service of the Episcopalian Diocese of Indianapolis, filed suit in federal court against Governor Pence and John Wernert, the Secretary of the Indiana Family and Social Services Administration, to block the cutoff of funds to Syrian refugees. On February 29, 2016, U.S. District Judge Tanya Walton-Pratt, in a 35-page ruling, said Indiana's policy amounted to unconstitutional discrimination on the basis of national origin, a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, as well as other tenets in civil rights law. She granted a preliminary injunction that prohibited Indiana, quote, from taking any actions to interfere with or attempt to deter the resettlement of Syrian refugees by that private agency. However, the state didn't give up. Governor Pence had his Solicitor General defend his restrictive policy last month. And the ruling came on September 14th in front of the U.S. Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. The Solicitor General of Indiana argued that the state has, quote, a compelling interest in protecting its residents from the well-documented threat of terrorists posing as refugees to gain entry into Western countries. The decision was that the three-judge panel unanimously rejected Pence's arguments that the terrorists are posing as Syrian refugees to gain entry into the United States. The panel called such speculation nightmare speculation, based on no evidence. Indeed, the court said the state presented no evidence that any Syrian refugee had been involved in any terrorist act in the United States. The panel's ruling is the latest in a series of federal court decisions that have rejected similar attempts by other states to avoid Syrian refugee resettlement. Interestingly, the national media labeled the three judges as conservative, and one of those judges appears on the list of possible Supreme Court nominees proposed by the Republican candidate. And finally, in the last year, Catholic Charities in the Archdiocese of Indianapolis has continued to settle refugees, including those whom the governor fears, welcoming 52 Syrians in the past 12 months. Now, I think we need to ask, where does the fear come from? Because I believe it's fear that is convincing not only people holding public office, but many of our contemporaries to turn our backs on a noble tradition, both religious and civic, in this country. I'll suggest that there are three reasons, I believe, for the fear. The most immediate cause of fear of the Syrian refugees is found in the well-publicized threats of terrorist groups, particularly the Islamic State. ISIS has specifically said it will send agents to sow havoc in the West. The reality is, the greatest casualties of ISIS have all been Muslims. The common refrain about vetting, voiced by Pence a year ago and repeated many times since, is that FBI Director James Comey has stated that it's impossible to know for certain who these refugees are. Now, those remarks were made in a very specific context, and the context is rarely given. When faced with the proposed Republican-sponsored legislation that asked the FBI director and other top national security officials to personally vouch for each and every admitted refugee, Comey balked at this notion. He said at a congressional hearing in December of last year, and I quote, "Could I certify to there being no risk associated with an individual? The Bureau does not take position on legislation, and we don't get involved in any policy decisions. But that practically would be impossible. Not wanting to assume direct personal accountability for each refugee is very different than saying that there's no way to vet them as being safe." So I think first the documented threats that have been made by different groups in the Middle East have given public officials the political ammunition. But I don't think that's the end of the story. The second reason for the fear is the collusion of the national media. News programs use a hierarchy now in determining on what stories to place before the public conscience. And put rather vulgarly, if it bleeds, it leads. News is a for-profit industry, and I would argue one that doesn't always strive to report the facts accurately. Have you noticed how difficult it is to be informed straightforwardly about local and national issues? In truth, watching the news can be a psychologically risky pursuit, which could undermine your mental and physical health. Particularly fear-based news stories prey on the anxieties we all have, and then they attempt to hold us hostage. Being glued to the television, reading the paper, or surfing the internet increases ratings and market shares, but it also raises the probability of eliciting hysteria and hatred. In previous decades, the journalistic mission was to report the news as it actually happened, and one could say with fairness, balance, and integrity. However, both the pressure of the 24-hour news cycle and the no-holds-barred competition among the competing networks have forced much of today's television news to look to the spectacular, the bizarre, the stirring, and the controversial as news stories. It's no longer a race to break the story first or get the facts straight. Instead, it's to acquire good ratings in order to get advertisers so that the profits may soar. I think that this mercenary attitude is particularly evident in reporting events from the Middle East. A new language, appropriated from spy novels, I suppose, has been used in reporting. How often did you hear about sleeper cells in the United States? References to a mysterious process dubbed radicalization as some sort of transformation that happens to people from reading things on the internet. In other words, to sow doubt and confusion and to keep you coming back. The third element that has constructed this fear is what I would term boundary maintenance, globalization, or a reaction to globalization, which generates the fear of the other. In part, this propagation of fear has been provoked by what some folks call postmodernity, understood as a set of cultural circumstances that signifies the obliteration of boundaries and the confusion of categories. Societies experience globalization and the mass migration of peoples. But however, this is interesting. I don't know if this has ever occurred to you. The most embodied, the fleshy parts of globalization, such as the movement of refugees and migrants, are increasingly restricted, while the most disembodied forms, such as the circulation of financial instruments and codes, are the most deregulated. In other words, we react to the phenomena of globalization and the collapse of boundaries and barriers by regulating what we can see. What we can see are the refugees. And because they do not have a power base in our country and often lack anyone to speak for them, they're easy prey. This, I believe, in the last decades has resulted in canonizing the Muslim as the other, as the one to be feared, as the one to be from whom we need to be protected. And it involves a lot of caricatures and knee-jerk responses. But combined, these issues, the threats, the experience of 9/11, the media and an irresponsible reporting, and finally, the experience of a reaction to globalization and the maintenance of new boundaries in order to reinforce an identity that seems to be slipping through our hands has resulted in the need for the other, the one from whom we need to be protected. Now, how do we, speaking as a Catholic community, react to this? Archbishop Kurtz, the president of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, wrote in the wake of the attacks in Paris, regardless of their religious affiliation or national origin, refugees are human persons, made in the image of God, bearing an inherent dignity and deserving our respect and care and protection by law from persecution. It is enlightening to note that each of the three great world religions, commonly referred to as religions of the book, assign far-reaching consequences to the act of protecting and saving the life of a single human being. Judaism teaches that he who saves the life of another has saved the entire world, while Islam characterizes the rescue of another as saving the life of the whole people. Christianity teaches an even more radical imperative. God identifies with those to whom service is given or refused, and our behavior towards others is our behavior towards God. When did we see you a stranger and not welcome you? Amen, I say to you, whatever you did for one of these least brothers or sisters of mine, you did to me. What's more, the principle of humanity is inscribed in the conscience of every person. And all people are obliged to protect the civil population from the effects of war. A particular category that merits our protection are those who have been displaced by war. What are we to do? Well, I think the USCCB has done some reflection, particularly in our Migrant and Refugee Services Office. And first, to insist that deserving, carefully vetted Syrian refugees being resettled in the United States are fleeing brutal violence. They didn't pick up and leave because they had a desire to come to the States. And that violence includes the brutality of the very terrorist groups which people fear. The United States handpicks these refugees who resettle here. They go through the most stringent sort of examination of anyone who wants to come to the United States. Multiple layers of interviews and security checks. Security screenings are rigorous and involve the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, the Department of Defense, and multiple intelligence agencies. This is not an either-or situation. The United States can continue to welcome refugees while continuing to ensure the security of its citizens. We must do both. Control over immigration and refugee admissions to the United States is a federal responsibility. Governors and states do not have the legal authority to determine who is admitted to the United States or who is to live in their states. After careful screening, Syrian refugees are legally admitted to the United States, and they can live wherever they want. Like other lawfully admitted persons, they have the right to freedom of movement within the United States. Governors do play an important role in welcoming refugees who have a long history of revitalizing many U.S. communities. The refugee program has a long history as a nonpartisan public and private partnership between the federal government and state governments and local communities, including Catholic charities and social services across the country. And so we need to encourage governors to continue to play their important welcoming role. And finally, we need to urge public officials to avoid reactions that politicize the events in Paris or in this country, and to avoid misplaced blame that creates an atmosphere of fear. Instead, we urge public officials to stand in solidarity with Syrian refugees who themselves are victims. The United States resettles refugees of all faiths. Keeping some Syrian refugees out of the country based on their religion sends the wrong message to the rest of the world about who we are as Americans. We are a welcoming country with a religiously diverse society, and our resettlement program should continue to reflect this. To not do so only feeds into the propaganda of terrorist groups and effectively makes us all less safe. I never say in conclusion, because someone once said that when a bishop says in conclusion, it's another definition of second wind. I would simply point out that in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, in fact, are refugees. They flee the terror of Herod. They have to go to another foreign country. And although we're not informed by the gospel what happened to them there, we can only imagine that it mustn't have been easy. And so it's crucial that the Catholic community and people of goodwill contest the climate of fear that has festered in this country, particularly in the last 15 years. This fear dehumanizes us all, causes us to abandon our most precious religious and civic values. And the best way we can contest the fear is by putting a face on the statistics, a face like these. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Archbishop. That was very moving and touching in many respects. It's people like you who give hope to the values of this country. And those panel of judges, they also give hope, who took a very strong decision. I was thinking about, the whole idea of the place of refugees in the Islamic tradition. We are reminded that the Prophet Muhammad also had to leave Mecca and to go to Medina, where he was a refugee. And once he had some kind of authority there, he also then talked about the migrants and the helpers becoming family. So those who welcomed them, they intermarried, they shared their bread, and they became a family. And the Quran is very explicit about that when it says that, why will you not strive? Why will you not strive in the cause of God and in the cause of men, women, and children who are crying, "Oh God, deliver us from this place where the people are oppressing us, and make for amongst your people those who will protect us, and make from among your people those who will help us." So in many ways, those of us who are helping refugees, at least from the Quranic perspective, we can be counted as God's people. So I want to put it to you that I think we are on the same page about the necessity of this responsibility and to giving welcome to refugees. Just this past week, it didn't get very big media attention, but in Leipzig in Germany, two Syrian refugees handed over somebody that they felt who was up to no good, and he was viewed as someone who was doing some kind of ISIS work, and the refugees handed him over. This morning's newspaper, I read that individual had committed suicide. A great tragedy, but that is. Now, if you have some of your parishioners come and talk to you who want to assist and point you to that story, what's the kind of advice and how will you talk to them about their fears? Because in some ways, I know you talked about the exaggerated fears, you talked about the Islamophobic fears, but how would you talk to them about that?
Well, I think that I would begin by saying that there are people that make bad choices in every culture, including our own. And the notion, I mean, first I'm trying to think of the name of the research institute, a libertarian research institute I read recently said that your chances of being killed by a foreign-born terrorist in the United States is about 1 in 3.42 billion. So what they use that is then to illustrate one of the spokespersons for I believe the son of the Republican candidate had referred to Syrian refugees as poison Skittles. Well, you'd have to have a whole train of boxcars full of Skittles to have to maintain that ratio. So we're really not, I mean, if you look at it rationally, there's much more of a chance of being struck by lightning or winning the national lottery than it is of being harmed by a refugee. So, and the Word of God does not say that we simply help good people. And I think for us as Christians, disciples of Jesus, we know that Jesus lived that sort of disinterested and welcoming love, even when it was at personal risk to himself.
Yeah, I've been asked this question a great deal, that, how can you ensure that the refugees that we're going to come are going to not be up to no good? And I said, I got no guarantee, but that is the risk that we take to do good. And doing good has a risk, and I've been advising and saying that, do the vetting process to the best if you can. And there have been, Catholics in Italy, for instance, the Sant'Egidio, they've been doing phenomenal work in Europe itself, and we've not seen any kind of terrible consequences. And I think the event that you referred to about that one Syrian passport being found near the Paris bombers, it could have been just a refugee losing his or her passport. Or it could be that bad people take the passports of these refugees as a way for them to do bad things. There's no implication, no guilt to that. So I think we face a tremendous challenge in the skepticism of people, you were saying.
I was going to say, Professor, anybody who is familiar with the situation in Europe as compared to the United States knows that it is completely different. The sort of integration of immigrants in this country is much more positive and much more, serene because it's a different history. If you go to France and the bidonvilles that surround the big cities, where the immigrants are often, they're breeding grounds for resentment, and it's just simply because there hasn't been the sort of integration that I think that Francis is calling for. And that often has been, sometimes not without struggle, the history of the United States.
One of the things that we've also seen is that in the Middle East, for instance, you mentioned that the number of refugees in Lebanon, and there are several million in Turkey in camps. And unfortunately, the history of the Middle East has been that refugees are kept as refugees. So, for instance, Palestinian refugees are for decades refugees in places like Syria or in Iraq or in Lebanon. And it requires something. Many of the governments of the region are quick to write a check. Writing a check is easier than welcoming people into resettling them in deep ways. And I think that's a major issue that I think Muslim societies face. Muslim majority societies where they have the wealth, where they have the resources, that this is not taking off. I know international organizations, groups like Islamic Relief and others are trying, but they are incapable of influencing policy. I think where we could use our energies and our strength and our power as the United States is to encourage those countries to resettle refugees in those countries. It will be culturally continuous for them, for many of them. It will also give them, a sense of belonging to another subculture of the region. And one of the important things that you mentioned in one of the quotes, you talked about borders. And I think that, you talked about how obstructive borders have become and how we've become nationalists. So what is so different between a Syrian and an Iraqi? I mean, these lines were drawn in the sand, and they were told that you are now Syrian. Okay, historically there was something called Syria. Historically there was something called the Levant. We understand that as markings historically of people from regions, but these subdivisions of nation states were not there 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And so it seems that it seems that before we go to paradise, they're going to ask us for our social security number. Or it seems that we have to have our national IDs. Since when has that become something? But it seems that nationalism has been so destructive to the idea of care and compassion that we now have to negotiate boundaries and borders in order to help people.
Especially when that nationalism, Professor, has been imposed or has at its root of colonialism.
I know.
That imposed these artificial borders. You see that in the Middle East, where modern countries that we know were creations of colonial powers. It's even more evident in Africa.
I do think that those of us who are afraid about development should use our energies in order to encourage a greater compassion across the world and for societies to take in. We are running out of time. I need to ask, at least we can take one or two questions. Let's take it. It seems that as a student, you get priority.
Your Eminence, thank you for coming. You have blessed us with very provocative remarks. I think they're very enriching of our perspective. I'm a freshman here at Notre Dame. And my question for you is, moving forward, how do you pragmatically plan to deal with both elected officials and cultural icons who may resist this stance of hospitality? You resisted Governor Pence before, thoughtfully and kindly, but now as you face the possibility of the election officials who, even at federal level, may resist your efforts of hospitality, how do you personally plan to react to these officials?
Well, I think that by giving an alternative message, and that's what I tried to do in our conversations, and I still have a relationship with Governor Pence. I mean, we don't like throw punches or anything. But and St. Paul insists that we pray for our elected superior provincials, and he was praying for a very brutal and violent empire. We're not praying. We don't have quite that problem. So I think it's always an effort to try and open bridges, build bridges, and to keep talking. And sometimes to just simply say no. There's one of my favorite novels was a novel written about the Italy just before World War II. It was an anti-fascist novel called Bread and Wine, Pane e Vino. And there's a scene, if I recall, where this young woman goes to see her parish priest, and she says, what are we to do? The armies, let me see, the armies of the night are on the march. The machinery of death is in motion. What do we do? And the priest said, I'm not really sure what we can do, but I do know this. What keeps tyrants awake at night is the little person that goes into the piazza, the town square, and writes no on the wall. And I think for us, there's simply moments where we have to say no. No, we won't be part of an ill-founded, immoral, and in fact illegal policy. And so I am a firm believer that you hang in there, you know, and you listen, but you also speak.
Last question. Mayor.
Thanks for being here. So much of the debate and the dialogue is playing out in national politics, governor's offices, federal courtrooms. All of these refugees of course come from a community and they come to another community. I'm curious for your counsel on what a city might do, either officials or residents, to live out the values of welcome.
Well, I mentioned it in my talk, Your Honor, that you know, what we do at Catholic Charities would be impossible if we just relied on the staff. And the volunteers are incredible. And I think the incident with with Governor Pence really brought to the fore the welcoming attitude of people of this state. You know, I'm from Detroit, so you know, it's not a bad thing, but you know. When I arrived here, I heard a lot about Hoosier hospitality, and I thought it was a cutesy slogan that Visit Indy had thought up. But then I found it's a reality, you know, at least among a lot of the Hoosiers that I know. You know, they naturally will welcome people if they're given the chance. So the reaction was, by and large, positive. Interestingly enough, the first group to donate, because we were supporting these refugees on our own, was the largest synagogue in Indianapolis, which I thought was very telling. You know.
Before I invite Christine, how is your refugee family doing?
They're doing very well. They're doing very well. One of the strong points why we wanted to resettle this family, besides the fact that they've been 3 years in a refugee camp, the mother has a sister in Indianapolis.
Oh, wow.
And so there's a strong support group for her.
Well, thank you for that act.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I think Archbishop Tobin, I speak on behalf of the whole audience, that you only affirmed our faith at the beginning in your presentation. It's been terrific. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Musa. Please join us all for lunch in the atrium.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Very nice.
Wonderful.
I hope someday you will see you in my home.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Inshallah.